The chalk trembled in Emily's hand as she crossed the threshold of the classroom she was once expelled from, the echoes of laughter and shame lingering in the corners like ghosts that had never left. She thought, "This is where my reputation died." The air smelled faintly of dust and old varnish, and every scrape of her shoes against the floor felt like a confession. Mr. Reynolds, the stern figure who had signed her expulsion a decade ago, sat near the back as if waiting for her to prove the years had meant something. Emily whispered to herself, "If I falter now, I lose more than a lesson. I lose myself." Her palms stung from gripping the chalk too tightly, and the blackboard seemed like a wall between past failure and possible redemption. She remembered the diploma that had never hung on her wall, folded in a drawer until the paper curled like an accusation. The silence was unbearable, heavier than any voice, but it dared her to speak. She raised the chalk, every heartbeat saying no, but her will saying yes. The board became her battlefield, and the first line would decide whether she could belong again. Emily forced her shoulders back as she stared at the board, the silence so thick it seemed to weigh on her lungs. She thought of the nights she replayed this moment in her head, wishing she had stayed, wishing she had fought harder. She imagined her mother's disappointed voice echoing like thunder, and she clenched her jaw. Mr. Reynolds cleared his throat softly, reminding her that someone was watching, judging, waiting for proof. Emily whispered, "This isn't about them, it's about me." Her hand steadied as the chalk finally touched the board, the faint scrape cutting through the heavy air. For the first time in years, she wrote her own name, not hiding it, but claiming it. The letters were shaky but bold, a declaration against the silence. She realized that this classroom wasn't her prison anymore. It was her test, and she had chosen to take it. The chalk screeched faintly as Emily finished the last letter of her name, and she flinched at the sound, half expecting laughter to follow as it once had. But the room stayed silent, the desks holding only shadows. She stepped back, staring at the board, her name glowing faintly in white. It looked fragile, but it was hers. Mr. Reynolds leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowed as if measuring the weight of her act. She thought, he won't clap, but maybe he won't dismiss me either. Her chest rose with the first steady breath she had taken since walking in, and her heart slowed its frantic pounding. She whispered, "This is my start." For a moment, she almost believed she belonged. The silence felt less like judgment now, and more like space waiting to be filled with proof. Emily turned slowly toward Mr. Reynolds, bracing for the verdict in his eyes. His expression was sharp, but not cruel, lined with years of seeing students stumble and rise. He said nothing, only adjusted his glasses and leaned back as if giving her space to continue. She felt a sting of defiance rise in her chest and she whispered, "I don't need his approval to keep going." Yet a part of her craved it, the part that had been 18 and desperate for one adult to believe she was more than her mistakes. The clock ticked louder than her thoughts, marking each second of silence. She forced herself to stand taller, clutching the chalk like a weapon. She would write again, not just her name but the first lesson she wanted to claim back as her own. Emily pressed the chalk back to the board and began to write a simple equation she remembered from her last lesson, before expulsion. Her hand steadied as numbers and symbols formed under her touch, clumsy at first but gaining rhythm. She felt her pulse slow, her body remembering what her mind had long suppressed. Mr. Reynolds shifted again, but this time his eyes softened almost imperceptibly. She thought, "This is what I was denied, but I can reclaim it." The board filled slowly with the fragments of her learning, each mark proof that her past did not erase her ability to begin again. She whispered, "I am not finished." And for the first time, she believed it. Emily lowered the chalk and stared at what she had written, the simple equation shimmering like proof against her shame. She thought, "This is not about numbers. It's about claiming space I once lost." Her breath steadied, and she felt the first crack in the wall she had carried for years. Mr. Reynolds adjusted his glasses but remained silent, his gaze unreadable. The silence pressed in again, and Emily realized this journey was not about him. It was about her battle to forgive herself. She whispered, I will not run this time. The thought of her younger self flooded her mind, the girl who had left in tears, the girl who had given up. Emily pressed her hand against the board, feeling its cool surface as if it could anchor her to the present. She knew she had only just begun, and the hardest part lay ahead. But she also knew she was not here to beg for permission. She was here to prove she could rise. Emily closed her eyes briefly, recalling the nights she had dreamed of walking back into this very room. In her mind she had begged, shouted, even wept, but tonight she chose silence and action instead. She thought of her mother who had refused to attend the expulsion hearing, the absence cutting deeper than words. Her chest tightened at the memory of betrayal, but she reminded herself that wounds can also shape strength. She whispered, "I will not be that girl again." Mr. Reynolds tapped his pen against the desk softly, the sound echoing like a metronome. Emily let the rhythm steady her heartbeat as she began writing again, not for approval, but for herself. The air felt charged, like a storm waiting to break. She knew she had to face the truth of who she was and who she wanted to be in this room. Emily stepped back, staring at the half-filled board, her handwriting uneven but alive. She felt the weight of every unfinished promise pressing on her shoulders. She remembered nights she had worked menial jobs, hiding the fact she had once been a top student. Shame had followed her like a shadow, whispering she was never enough. Now, standing in the same place where failure had been stamped on her, she chose to answer with persistence. Mr. Reynolds shifted forward, resting his chin on his hand as though studying her carefully. She thought, "He won't say it, but he's waiting to see if I collapse." Emily raised the chalk again, her wrist steady now, and wrote the next line with deliberate strength. She whispered, "This is mine." The room felt less like a tomb, and more like a chance to breathe again. The chalk slipped from Emily's fingers, clattering onto the floor, the sound startling in the silence. Her heart skipped, and for a second, panic threatened to overtake her. She remembered the laughter from years ago when she had dropped her books, when weakness had been her scarlet letter. But this time no one laughed. Mr. Reynolds simply raised an eyebrow, and Emily bent down to retrieve the chalk with slow determination. She told herself, falling is not failing. Staying down is. She held the chalk again, her grip firm, and faced the board. Her reflection faintly shimmered against the black surface, showing not just the woman she was now, but the girl she had been. She whispered, "I'm still here." And in that moment, the shame began to loosen its grip. Emily straightened, chalk in hand once more, and pressed it firmly to the board. This time she did not hesitate. Numbers flowed with a new steadiness, her strokes deliberate, her mind clear. She felt a power rising in her chest, the kind that comes from choosing to stand when you have every reason to fall. Mr. Reynolds leaned back, his face unreadable, but his silence no longer crushing. Emily thought, "He sees me trying, and that is enough." She remembered the night she folded her unused diploma and shoved it into a drawer, her hands shaking with defeat. Tonight, she unfolded herself instead. She whispered, "This is the beginning." And for the first time since she entered, the classroom no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like possibility. Emily wiped the chalk dust from her palm, her skin raw, her chest rising with uneven breaths. The board before her felt like both battlefield and confession. She thought, this is not just about lessons. It's about dignity. Outside these walls, life pressed just as fiercely. Bills she could not pay, a landlord impatient for rent, applications stamped unanswered. She felt the truth coil in her chest. If she failed here, she lost more than pride, she lost the fragile hope she carried. Mr. Reynolds leaned forward, his voice clipped but steady. "Discipline is more than marks on a board." The words hit like a verdict, and Emily forced her jaw tight. She whispered, "I will not fold." Every scratch of chalk echoed in her ears, loud as a gavel. Her hand slowed but did not stop. Each symbol was proof she had chosen to return, even if the past demanded she stay gone. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, faint but constant, like judgment that never eased. Emily thought, "Every system is built to remind me I am not trusted." She remembered watching others stand before parole boards, their promises weighed against suspicion. Though she was not bound by law, she carried the same weight. One slip, one misstep, and her second chance would vanish. Mr. Reynolds tapped his fingers against the wood of his desk, each knock sharp as iron. Emily's hand trembled before she steadied it, pressing chalk harder into the board, determined not to flinch. She whispered, "Every step costs me." Images of missed buses, ignored calls, and doors closing on her face swarmed her mind. Yet she stayed upright, defiance burning in her chest like a fragile fire. The chalk screeched across the board, louder than the doubts. She thought, "If pain is the price, I'll pay in full." The creak of the door jolted Emily, and her chalk nearly snapped. She turned to see Mrs. Carter, the vice principal whose signature had sealed her expulsion years ago. The woman's presence pulled old wounds wide open. Mrs. Carter's voice, calm but razor-edged, cut through the silence. "Some debts do not fade." Emily's stomach nodded, but she lifted her chin, whispering, "I didn't come for your forgiveness." The woman's eyes narrowed, arms crossed tight, her posture a wall of disapproval. The air thickened, memories colliding with the present, the whispers in the hallway, the smirks of students, the final slammed door. Emily gripped the chalk harder and turned back to the board, writing with a force that felt like defiance itself. The squeal of chalk filled the air, drowning the weight of judgment behind her. She thought, "They may not believe me, but I will not break for them." Emily's wrist throbbed, but she pressed harder, chalk grinding under her grip. Mrs. Carter's stare burned into her back, cold and unyielding. Emily whispered, "I cannot undo what's done, but I can outlive it." Mr. Reynolds shifted, eyes flicking between them, measuring whether resilience could outweigh reputation. Emily's mind raced to neighbors, who still muttered her name like a warning, to parents who told their children she was a lesson in failure. The chalk suddenly snapped in her hand, fragments scattering to the floor. Silence struck like a hammer. For one breath she froze, shame whispering she was that girl again. Then she bent, picked up the larger piece, and pressed it back to the board, her voice low but fierce. "I not finished." The words steadied her pulse. For the first time in years, the fracture did not feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning. Emily pressed the chalk fragment to the board, each stroke deliberate, loud, filling the silence with defiance. Mrs. Carter's voice slid across the room, sharp but low. "You can write, but can you endure?" Emily's hand did not waver. She thought, "Endurance is all I have left." Sweat rolled down her temple, but her posture straightened, spine unbroken. Mr. Reynolds leaned back, his silence neither cruel nor kind, but heavy with judgment. Emily whispered, "I have paid already." Her voice was low, but it clung to the air like truth itself. Mrs. Carter shifted, her arms loosening slightly, doubt flickering across her stern mask. Emily filled the board with numbers and words until no space remained, her chest heaving, the room ringing with chalk. She turned, not to ask for permission but to claim her place. She thought, "This is no longer their verdict, it's my story." Emily stepped back from the board, her chest heaving, the chalk fragment worn thin between her fingers. She turned toward Mr. Reynolds and Mrs. Carter, expecting silence, maybe dismissal. Instead, Mr. Reynolds spoke, his tone sharp but tinged with something heavier. "Do you even know why you were expelled?" The word struck harder than any gavel. Emily froze, memories replaying of stolen glances, whispered rumors, accusations that had never been explained. She thought, "I was guilty because they said I was." Mr. Reynolds' eyes narrowed. "It wasn't the test. It wasn't your anger. It was the paper." Confusion knifed through her chest. Emily whispered, "What paper?" Mrs. Carter stepped forward, pulling an envelope from her bag, the edges frayed with time. Her voice carried no softness. "The confession we were told you wrote." Emily's blood turned cold. She had never written such a thing. Her second chance cracked, and a new truth waited to be revealed. Emily's knees nearly buckled as her eyes locked on the envelope. A memory clawed at her. The day she was called to the office. A paper she never saw. The decision already made before she spoke. She thought, they never asked me. They judged me. Mrs. Carter placed the envelope on the desk with slow precision, her voice cold but steady. This document said you admitted to cheating. Emily's breath caught, anger and disbelief mixing in her chest like fire. She whispered, I never wrote that. Mr. Reynolds leaned forward, frowning, his tone doubtful but not dismissive. Then who did? The question cracked open a silence that had lasted a decade. Emily clenched her fists, her pulse racing. The walls seemed to close in, not with shame, but with the need for truth. She thought, my failure was built on a lie. Her second chance was no longer about proving worth. It was about reclaiming her name. Emily reached for the envelope, her fingers trembling as though touching something poisonous. The paper inside crackled with age, words scrawled in handwriting that looked nothing like hers. She whispered, this isn't mine. Mrs. Carter's face tightened, her voice defensive. It came from your desk. Emily's mind raced back, the last day she had sat here, her things scattered, her bag searched while she protested. She remembered classmates whispering, one in particular, Daniel, the rival who had always wanted her place at the top. She thought, he wrote this. The realization punched her chest with clarity. She turned to Mr. Reynolds, her voice steady but laced with fire. You condemned me for something I never confessed. Mr. Reynolds' stern mask flickered, uncertainty creeping in. Emily held the paper high, as if daring the walls themselves to deny her. She thought, the truth has been waiting for me to claim it. Emily's voice grew stronger as she laid the paper on the desk, the sound sharp against the wood. She said, you expelled me on a forgery. Mr. Reynolds' gaze hardened, but his voice held hesitation. The evidence was clear back then. Emily snapped, her tone raw. Clear to who? You never asked me. Mrs. Carter's lips pressed into a thin line, the weight of years of certainty pressing back. Emily thought of all she had lost, the diploma never earned, the jobs never taken, the self-respect she had buried. She whispered, my life was broken on this lie. The silence thickened, but for the first time, power shifted. Emily was not pleading, she was indicting. The truth forced itself into the room like a storm breaking glass. She thought, this second chance isn't just survival, it's justice. Her eyes locked on both of them, daring them to deny what the paper revealed. The classroom felt charged, every breath trembling with the weight of revelation. Emily stood taller, the forged confession still on the desk. She said, this is why I was broken. This is why I was erased. Her voice no longer cracked with fear, but rang with clarity. Mr. Reynolds closed his eyes briefly, then opened them, his tone heavy. If this is true, we failed you. Mrs. Carter shifted uneasily, her arms lowering, the authority in her posture faltering. Emily whispered, I carried punishment for something I never did. The truth was a wound, but also a weapon. For the first time, she felt the balance tilt in her favor. She thought, redemption was never mine to ask, it was theirs to return. And as silence spread again, Emily knew the cost of her second chance had just doubled. To win it now, she would need to fight with more than endurance, she would need truth itself. Emily stood before the board, her breath heavy, the forged confession still burning like a scar on the desk. She realized the truth had given her a choice. Silence would be safety, but honesty would cost everything. Mr. Reynolds asked, his voice tense, will you admit what matters most? The room seemed smaller, the air hotter, as if time demanded her answer. Emily whispered, the lie ruined me, but the truth can free me. She thought of her mother's silence, her lost years, the jobs she never held. Shame tugged at her, but defiance steadied her spine. Mrs. Carter's eyes flickered, doubt and guilt clouding her certainty. Emily's chest rose with resolve. She knew this was not about grades, nor reputation. It was about whether she would finally speak without fear. Her voice grew louder, breaking the silence. I was innocent, and I will not live as if I was guilty. Emily pressed both palms against the chalkboard, her voice shaking but clear. You took 10 years from me on the strength of a lie. Mr. Reynolds' jaw tightened, but he did not look away. Mrs. Carter shifted, her arms lowering slightly, her posture breaking under the weight of doubt. Emily thought, if I fall silent now, the lie wins forever. Her breath came in quick bursts, her heart hammering, but she refused to let fear swallow her words. She remembered nights she could not sleep, replaying that day, begging for answers that never came. She whispered, I am not here for pity. I am here to reclaim what I was robbed of. The air trembled with her defiance. For the first time, her shame did not own her voice. Instead, the truth became her weapon, sharper than any rumor, heavier than any silence. The silence broke when Mr. Reynolds rose from his chair, his hands flat on the desk, his eyes sharp but no longer distant. He said, if this paper was forged, then the system failed you. Emily felt her throat tighten at his words, but she held steady, refusing relief without accountability. Mrs. Carter shook her head, her voice low. We trusted the evidence, but maybe we were wrong. Emily snapped back. Not maybe, you were. Her voice cracked, not from weakness but from fire. Years of buried pain spilled into the room like thunder. She whispered, I carried this weight while you walked away. Mr. Reynolds' eyes softened just barely, as if the truth was chiseling through stone. Emily thought, this is the moment everything changes, if I do not falter. Her fists loosened, but her stance only grew stronger. The cost of speaking was high, but silence would have been worse. Emily turned, holding the forged confession high, her voice loud enough to echo. This paper destroyed me, but it is not mine. I will not carry its lies any longer. She slammed it back on the desk, the sound sharp as a gavel. Mrs. Carter flinched, her lips parting as though words had deserted her. Mr. Reynolds looked down at the page, his face pale, the authority in his posture slipping. Emily thought, this is my verdict now. She remembered the girl she had been, standing in the hallway begging for someone to listen, and she felt the sting of abandonment all over again. But now she stood older, stronger, refusing to be erased. She whispered, I am not the story you wrote for me. The words echoed like a vow. The board behind her, covered in chalk, seemed less like evidence of failure and more like proof of survival. The room felt transformed, no longer a prison but a courtroom, no longer a classroom but a stage for reckoning. Emily stood center, voice clear. I was never guilty. I will not live as if I was. Her words carved into the air, undeniable. Mr. Reynolds lowered his head, the weight of his silence finally shifting into acknowledgment. Mrs. Carter's arms hung loose, her gaze breaking, guilt softening the steel in her eyes. Emily thought, this moment cannot be undone. She realized her second chance was no longer just survival. It was truth reclaimed at the highest cost. Her body shook, but not from fear. It was the release of years of silence breaking free. She whispered one final time, not as plea but declaration, this is my story now. The echo lingered like a verdict. She had chosen honesty over comfort, and it had changed everything. The chalkboard stood heavy with numbers and words, a monument to everything Emily had fought to reclaim. She felt the silence stretch, but it was no longer suffocating, it was witness. Mr. Reynolds exhaled slowly, his voice lower than before. Perhaps the system failed you, but today you proved who you are. His words were not an apology, but they cracked the stone that had weighed on her chest for years. Mrs. Carter's gaze dropped to the floor, her certainty broken, her authority weakened. Emily whispered, I don't need absolution, only acknowledgement. Her body trembled with exhaustion, but her spirit burned steady. For the first time, she stood not as the expelled girl, but as the woman who had returned to finish what was stolen. The weight of her second chance settled, less victory, more responsibility. She thought, now I must live as if I deserve it. Emily gathered her things slowly, her fingers brushing the chalk fragments scattered on the floor. She thought of the years when her hands had held only rejection slips and folded receipts of failure. Tonight they held proof. Mrs. Carter cleared her throat, her tone softer. We cannot erase the past, but perhaps we can repair what remains. Emily's chest tightened at the words. She had long stopped waiting for kindness from this place. Mr. Reynolds nodded faintly, his eyes locked on her like a ledger finally corrected. Emily whispered, "Repair is all I've ever wanted." Her shoulders dropped, the strain of years beginning to lift. She realized this chance was not just for her dignity, it was for every person who had been silenced by assumption. The classroom no longer mocked her. It listened, and she stood ready to leave the past written on the board where it belonged. Emily turned to leave, her eyes lingering on the chalkboard one last time. She thought, I no longer fear this room. Her name written there did not look fragile now. It looked earned. Mr. Reynolds called after her, his voice rough but steady. If you are ready, the door is open. It was not permission, not forgiveness, but it was recognition. Emily felt tears press behind her eyes, but she held them back, not out of pride but strength. Mrs. Carter moved aside from the door, her rigid stance softened, her eyes no longer walls but windows. Emily whispered, I am ready. Each word was simple, yet heavy with all the years she had lost. The floor creaked beneath her steps, but instead of sounding like weakness, it rang like passage. She thought, I walked in broken, I leave whole. The hallway stretched before Emily, empty, yet alive with echoes of her younger self. She remembered the day she was escorted out, the laughter that followed her like chains. Tonight, those echoes carried no power. She whispered, this is not exile, it's return. Her footsteps clicked softly against the tiles, each one heavier with release than with fear. Behind her, the classroom door creaked shut, but this time it was not closing her out, it was sealing the past inside. Mr. Reynolds' silhouette lingered briefly in the doorway before fading into shadow. Mrs. Carter remained silent, her figure stiff, but her eyes followed Emily with unspoken recognition. Emily thought, second chances are not given, they are seized. For the first time in years, her chest expanded fully, her breath free. She knew her story was not finished here, it had only been rewritten. Emily stepped into the open air, the cool night pressing against her skin like a baptism. The sky glowed faintly with the last streaks of dusk, and for the first time in years, the horizon looked reachable. She thought of the folded diploma in her drawer, of the jobs she had lost, of the name whispered in judgment. Now she carried none of it as chains. She whispered, I am not finished, I am becoming. Behind her the building loomed, but its weight no longer crushed her. Ahead the world waited, not forgiving, not easy, but open. Emily's lips curved into the smallest smile, fragile yet real. Her second chance was not a gift, it was something she had fought for, clawed for, earned. And in the silence of the night, she felt steady enough to carry it. The cost had been steep, but the truth was worth every scar. The night air wrapped around Emily as she stepped farther from the school, her steps echoing across the quiet pavement. She thought of the years when her name was spoken only with scorn, yet tonight it had been written on the board in her own hand. She whispered, I am not the girl who left in shame, I am the woman who returned. Behind her, the windows glowed faintly, as if the building itself acknowledged her defiance. Mr. Reynolds' silence and Mrs. Carter's faltering gaze followed her like distant shadows, reminders of what she had overcome. She clenched her fists not in anger but in promise. She thought, the world still doubts me, but it will not define me. Her second chance had not been handed down like mercy, it had been seized, fought for, earned in sweat and truth. She walked on, her steps steady, her heart resolved, her story her own at last. Emily paused near the gate, her eyes lifting to the horizon where city lights blinked faintly in the distance. Oh! She thought of her mother, of the diploma folded in a drawer, of the years defined by silence. She whispered, I survived what was meant to erase me. The words felt heavier than stone, but also freer than air. She realized forgiveness might never come, not from her family, not from the institution, not from the community that branded her. Yet she no longer needed their verdict. Her truth was enough. She breathed deeply, letting the night fill her lungs with cold clarity. Emily thought, "This is not the end. It is the beginning." For the first time in a decade, the world beyond the gate looked less like exile and more like possibility. She stepped forward, her shadow stretching long behind her, no longer bound by the past, but carried by the truth. The silence of the night reminded Emily of all the voices she had once feared: teachers, neighbors, even her own. They had written her as failure, but tonight she rewrote herself. She whispered, "Second chances aren't free. I paid in full." Her words carried no bitterness, only weight. She thought of the scars, the humiliations, the years stolen by a forged confession. Those could never be returned, but they no longer held her hostage. Mr. Reynolds' reluctant acknowledgment and Mrs. Carter's silence were not absolution, but they were cracks in the wall of judgment. Emily thought, "I don't need their blessing. I have my truth." She walked forward, her steps deliberate, her head high. The road stretched ahead, uncertain but hers. The air carried no applause, only the sound of her own heartbeat steady at last. That was enough to make her believe she could keep walking. Emily reached the edge of the block, the streetlights flickering overhead. She thought of her younger self, 18, being escorted out with tears burning her face. That girl had walked into exile. This woman walked into freedom. She whispered, "I owe her this victory." The image of the forged paper burned in her mind, not as shame but as proof of what she had survived. She thought, "They tried to bury me in a lie, but I grew beyond it." Her chest rose with steady breath, her hands loose at her sides now, no longer trembling. The night sky stretched above, vast and dark, but no longer empty. Emily felt a strange peace settle in, sharp and quiet, the kind that comes when truth is no longer hidden. She thought, "This story will not end in silence." And she walked into the night, no longer chased, no longer erased. Emily stopped at the corner, the night stretching endless before her. She whispered, "They wrote me out once, but I wrote myself back in." Her words echoed in her chest like a vow. She thought of every cost paid, time, dignity, trust, and knew nothing could return what was lost. But she had something greater, the knowledge that she had endured, that she had spoken when silence was demanded. Her second chance was not mercy, not charity, not forgiveness. It was the raw, undeniable truth. She lifted her chin, eyes sharp, her steps ready for the road ahead. She whispered once more, each word like iron, "This is my story now." The night did not answer, but it did not need to. Emily carried her answer within. And as she stepped forward into the darkness, she left one final truth behind, broken, silenced, erased, but never defeated.